Hello, boys and girls. Gather around the campfire as Papa Federico and Delango Lunde tell you some beautiful stories. Because this episode of How to Sell Insurance Podcast is about storytelling and why it's important to tell stories. We're going to be covering, number one, what a good third-party story is. Number two, when to share stories. And number three, probably the most important, why to share stories, like what you're going to get from mixing in third-party stories and telling features and benefits to clients in the form of stories and why that's going to increase your bottom line and sell more insurance. So let's talk about the first one, which is just, what is a third-party story? I can tell you that this has been a huge impact for me. I have a personal story of why I believe in insurance, things that have happened in my life that insurance has changed the course of, that I can then share with a client. And I can share an experience that I had with a loved one who was in an accident or who died or something like that, that insurance was there to save the day, or an experience I had with a loved one or a family member who died or had a major illness or something like that didn't have insurance, and what that looked like for them without insurance and why that inspired me to get into this industry. And so third-party stories are super important to engage the client because we're used to hearing stories. Think about from a kid, like we started off this episode, reading stories or watching Netflix, or we're watching reels or things like that on social media. This is how our brain takes in information these days. And so if you're not mixing in stories about somebody else or a third party into your sales presentation, you're going to miss a lot of selling because people are tuning you out. They're not listening to you anymore. I promise. Even if they're looking at you with eye contact, they're thinking about what they've got to do after this meeting. So Ashton, man, I'd love to hear from you. Just when you're in an appointment, what are some of the places that you're telling stories, either of clients or of families or of yourself? What are some of the places in an appointment that you're telling stories?
I think for me, I do storytelling when objections come up. So the place where I'm inserting stories, at least in my presentation, and everyone's different. A lot of people, they kind of have standard stories they tell at the beginning, role and purpose, wherever it is. But for me, it's more when objections come up. So if I have some type of objection, that's where I start inserting stories. Not always. It depends on the client and where we're at. But if I'm getting any kind of objection, that's when I start inserting stories. I was running an appointment one time with another agent, and he started getting objections like, all right, great, well, we're going to think about this. He's like, hey, absolutely, definitely want you to think about it. I had this client one time, her name was, such and such. And she said she wanted to think about it. By the time she came back, something changed in her health. It was only 3 months later, but she went to the doctor and she had a diagnosis. And she's like, all right, great, I want to get that coverage now, but I had this change in my health. He said, well, great. Well, good news is we're going to be able to get you coverage. However, we can't get the same policy now. We don't medically qualify anymore because X, Y, and Z happen. We now have to get a different type of policy. And in order to get the same amount of coverage, it's going to be a lot more money now because we have to switch the kind of policy. And he goes, you guys are in perfect health right now, to the best of your knowledge. We don't have anything looming on our medical record. We want to go ahead and lock in that coverage before something does change. And I get you, you think something might not, but we don't know what's going to happen. And so while you guys are thinking about it, figuring out exactly which one to get, let's lock in one we know absolutely works well. And if we want to, get more coverage or even get less, well, we can make those changes we want, within 30 days. And some carriers even go as far as 90 days.
Absolutely. I think it's so important to have these stories planned out, to know how you tell them and to know where you tell them. So I want to give you an example as well. Ashton gave you one. I'll give you one. There is a person on our team, real story, and I would highly suggest that you always use real stories, even if it's not your own. Even if you say, hey, I had a colleague that told me this story the other day, and here's an example, and you can tell Ashton's story, or you can tell my story. We have a person on our team, shout outs to Clark Chaston. We call him Paper Chaston. Clark was 46 years old. He's working in finance, and he was walking his dog behind his house, had a massive stroke at 46 years old. That was about 3.5 years ago. And in decent health, but it has taken Clark 3, almost 4 years to get himself back in the position where he can really even work. Even when I met him a couple of years ago, it was really difficult for him to retain information. And, it was really hard for him to get the energy up to meet with clients. And he failed his exam a couple of times to get his insurance license because he just wasn't able to focus. He was unable to work. He couldn't earn an income. And really being in our industry is one of the only ways that he could earn an income at that point, because everybody around him knew that he had a stroke and that this was affecting him. And he was able to tell him, hey, look, I can get you living benefits. And if what happened to me happens to you, you're going to get this payout. And so I tell the story about Clark because the reality is that if the person that I'm meeting with had a stroke like Clark, they're probably unprepared for not being able to work for several years, not being able to earn an income for a long time, and having their life turned upside down by a traumatic event. Some people who have strokes are, back to work in 2 weeks. Some people who have strokes are multiple years. Some people never recover. It just depends on, the severity of the illness. And so I tell this story about Clark when I'm explaining living benefits that, hey, if he would have had these living benefits, he would have had a payout of X amount of dollars at the time of his stroke, and he would have been able to replace his income for X number of years while he recovered. But since he didn't have this coverage put in place, he had life insurance. Didn't matter because he didn't die, so life insurance didn't pay out. And so I use this story as a way to explain the value of living benefits rather than me just telling the client living benefits are valuable. Right? I need to illustrate the way that living benefits could impact them if what happened to Clark happens to them. And that's an effective story. And I highly suggest if you're not adept at storytelling, if you're not good at storytelling, there's tons of courses that you can go through that teach you how to tell stories effectively and how to crescendo and how to deliver points. We're not going to take a ton of time to do that because you can research all that on YouTube. There's a great masterclass on storytelling as well if you subscribe to masterclass. But being able to deliver the features and benefits of your product in the form of a story is incredibly, incredibly impactful. So, Ashton, let's talk about as far as sort of the second topic of telling stories, right? When we're delivering a story, where do we want to move people to? So you deliver this story and then you're transitioning it back to them. And so what are some of the things that you are asking, sort of transitioning between I told this story and now I want to bring you back to the point of you getting insurance? What are some of the ways that you do that?
I think one of those first things you have to do is you have to let the story work. So you told the story and you told the story for a reason. You didn't tell it just to have something to say and fill the air with. So you have to let your pause have effect. There's a reason I've told a story, because it's made to elicit a certain response. And so when I tell that story, I have to let that pause be on purpose. Now, some stories, there isn't a pause at the end to elicit a response. It depends on the kind of story I'm telling. But if I'm telling a story and I want their feedback on what I've said, I have to sit and wait. Sometimes it's 5 seconds, sometimes it's 45 seconds, but I have to sit and wait for that response.
Dude, have you ever had it happen where you deliver a story and you think it's super impactful and you wait for that pause and they're just like, so? You know what I mean? The client just doesn't care at all about your story. God, I've had that happen so many times and I'm just like, okay, let's move on then, I guess. You're a cold individual. God, it's so awkward when that happens.
Yeah, and that's the part of telling the right story at the right time. Making sure that we're finding those stories that align with that client. And the biggest thing, like you said, we're not just going to make up random stories. We have to find those real stories, and those exist. Google all types of things and find it on YouTube of stories if you don't have one, or talk with the person that hired you. They have stories. There's stories that exist throughout your company. But finding those stories, making sure it's the right one. And then if it's a story that's simply I'm not trying to get a response from, saying, hey, we don't know what kind of health you're going to be in down the road because of who knows however many things. We need to make sure that we find the one that works well and absolutely is the best. Now,
Sure.
John, we have option 1, 2, or 3. Which one's going to work best for you based off of age? And I'm pivoting it back. One thing from we got to listen at our conference with Chris Smith. He talks about ARP and ARC: acknowledge, respond, and pivot, or acknowledge, respond, close. So you have to know where you're at in your process. If you're in the beginning or middle of your presentation, we're acknowledging the objection or the response that they gave. We're responding with a story, and we're pivoting to where we need to be. If I'm in my role and purpose and I go, well, we kind of think this is important. I don't know. We just filled it out just to see. Well, I don't really know why we're talking. Well, if I'm now going to tell a story there of, well, hey, listen, if something were to happen, the reason potentially why you might get something like mortgage protection is because if something were to happen to you, your spouse doesn't have to worry about, hey, is that home going to be taken care of? Because, do you want Susie to have to worry about taking care of this mortgage, finding another job, and then also taking care of daycare?
For sure.
Now that's my storyline.
You're pivoting.
Well, no, I don't. Okay, well, if Susie isn't going to have to worry about those things, what do we have in place in order to take care of that? Well, we don't have anything. So if she doesn't have that in place, well, now what are we doing?
You're hitting it right on the head, man. And by the way, shout out to Chris Smith and the conversion code. If y'all haven't read Chris Smith's book, The Conversion Code, we're not sponsored by him. We don't make any money if you buy that book. That book's incredible. If you're an insurance agent, if you're working leads, if you're getting in front of people, like, The Conversion Code should be a Bible for you. And man, loved getting a chance to chat with him at our national conference last year in Denver, and just an amazing individual. But I think that ARP, acknowledge, respond, and pivot. So this is how I use it. Let's just say I'm with somebody and I'm explaining the value of living benefits, and I use Clark's story. I tell them Clark had a stroke. This is what happened. This is what it looked like. This is when I met him. This was his inability. My pivot is going to be, so if something like that happened to you, what would it look like for you financially? What would you have to do? If you were in Clark's position, this is a real thing. Now there's a reality to it. What would you have to do? And I want them to get back into, now that I've heard this story, oh my God, if this happened to me, what would it look like? And I'm not just in theory pulling something out of the air going like, oh, if you were in a car accident, well, how would you pay for the bills? I'm not asking that. I'm going, wow, I had a client who was in a car accident on her way to work. She drove a similar amount of miles to you, and she got hit by somebody and fractured her spine and fractured her pelvis, and she was basically disabled. She was never able to go back to doing the job that she was doing before in the warehouse that she was working at. And thank goodness she had these living benefits, because they stepped in and they were able to help pay her mortgage. They were able to replace her income for a number of years when she was disabled. So if something like that happened to you, I mean, you're driving 60 miles a day for work, and one of these idiots out there talking on their cell phone or eating or putting on makeup or something like that, somebody hits you. If you weren't able to work for a little while, what would that look like for you financially? Would you be able to make it? What would happen to this house? What would happen to your standard of living? What would happen to your kids? What would happen, And now I told a real legit story that gets them thinking about, if that happened in my life, what would that be, right?
Yeah.
So I think being able to transition back into putting it on them, and the second part, if I'm getting an objection in the close, like you just said, Ashton, well, we want to think about it. Oh man, I've had plenty of people who've thought about it, and then something happened to them and they're no longer qualify. So why don't we at least apply and get some coverage put in place now? And you can think about it as you have coverage, right? Or you can shop around with some coverage already in place, rather than shopping around with no coverage. And while you're shopping around, you get in a car accident like that woman I was telling you about, and you no longer qualify for insurance. And so I think transitioning them back into one of those 2 points, such a great example, man. Let's get to the final point here, which is, why should you do this? Like, what are you going to get from this? And I have had so many more referrals from people since I started telling stories because I'm able to go, hey, do you know anybody else who drives very far for work?
Yeah.
Or do you know anybody else who, if they had a stroke or if they had a heart attack, their spouse doesn't work and their family would be in financial trouble? Or do you know somebody else who, they were diagnosed with cancer and they had to go through this, right? And I want to get with their friends and their family who know them, that they've had cancer. And like, hey, if what happened to Bill happens to you, we can get you covered, right? I want to talk to Bill because I want to tell Bill, look, I have this product that if what happened to you happens to your family, they would be covered. I'm sorry, Bill, I can't get it for you because this has already happened to you. But can you call the rest of your family and tell them I met this guy, and if I would have had this coverage when this happened, I would have gotten these results, and I think you should talk to him. Now I'm charging up referral after referral after referral after referral of people who are ready to get insurance because they know somebody personally in their life that would have benefited from this, all from me just telling stories.
Yeah.
From living in it.
And it can definitely generate those referrals like you're talking about. When you're sitting there telling those stories, it's bringing things to mind for them of other instances in their life of, hey, we've had this scenario before of the car crash, the cancer, whatever, and that wasn't taken care of. And hey, that person needs some help. Definitely want to get you their information so you can help them.
Yeah. Yeah, man. And when you stay in this business long enough, you're going to have your own stories.
Absolutely.
Right? Like we have a person in our team. I use his story all the time. He was with a client. He happens to live in Utah. He was with a client. They wrote an application on the client. They started to write an application on the wife, and the client had a heart attack. It was like, they were writing the application in the house, client had a heart attack. Thank goodness he was using an instant decision product that already had the coverage approved and was already withdrawn from the account before he had the heart attack, because the policy paid out. The insurance company was able to see this is the time the application was signed. This is the time the event happened. This is the time the heart attack happened, and they paid it out. And, again, I use that story all the time. When I'm meeting with clients, they go, I had a colleague who, he was sitting with a family. He happens to live in Utah, and he wrote a policy for the husband. And when they were writing the policy for the wife, the husband had a heart attack. And this is why I believe in using instant decision insurance. Because I want to get coverage on you right now, today, because I don't know if you leave the house tomorrow, if you're going to come back, or if you have a heart attack, or if you have a stroke, or if you're in a car accident or something. I want to get coverage put on you today. Does that make sense? Right? If something happened to you tomorrow, you're in a car accident, somebody hits you, what's it going to look like for you if you don't have this coverage put in place tonight? It enables me to build urgency because I can share the reality of things that have happened. And that's not even my story. Somebody on my, it's not even on my team, right? We're coworkers at this point. We're sidelined to each other, cross-lined to each other. So there's so much benefit that you can get from sharing stories of even other people with your clients to drive urgency and drive emotion and to have them see things from a different perspective and legitimacy, right? And more relevance in their life. So any final thoughts you got, man, on sharing third-party stories, Ashton?
Yeah, like you said, make sure, one, that they're real. Don't just use fake ones. Two, the longer you're in the business, you're going to have your own stories, and you're going to have those stories to make your own. But until then, borrow other people's stories. There's nothing wrong with that. And, build your own story library. Find a story for every single situation. Think of every objection you can get and find a story around it. That helps. Find a story for your why. That's one of the easiest ones to think of why are you in this industry, and have that story to share. Maybe that's a part of your appointment. For some agents, that's the first thing they do. They say, hey, here's my role and purpose. Here's what I do. And then also here's why I do it. So find that story for every situation. And that's going to help you allow that client to find the things that are best for them. Because again, we're not telling these stories to manipulate someone and to get them to buy, but we're using these stories to help show that client, here's why we need this coverage, and here are reasons you might need that within your own life, and here are real life examples to help you make a decision of what do we need and why do we need it.
If you're listening to this and you want a note to take away from this and some focus to take away from this, build your own story library, what Ashton just shared. That's the note to take away from this. Look at all those situations that you run into in sales and ask yourself, how could I have overcome this situation with a story? Practice them, have them in your back pocket, be ready to pull them out when you go into an appointment, be ready to share the stories. I tell the same 3 or 4 stories in most appointments that I'm in. And the third-party stories are so incredible. They're very powerful. They elicit movement and action because people are in tune to listen to stories. That's how we get information these days, right? Is telling an engaging story to somebody. So everybody, this concludes story time around the campfire here on the How to Sell Insurance podcast. As always, we're going to keep coming to you with fresh content. Like and subscribe. Hit the little bell so you know when we post new episodes. Share it with people. Any way that we can help bring value into your life, throw it in the comments. We would love to take input from people on new episodes to do. Stay tuned, everybody. We'll come back to you with more information later.